used to be that religion was your most deeply held belief. Today, because people are broadly secular and practically atheist, politics has become the more deeply held belief. Well, if you don't agree with their most deeply held beliefs, you're not going to be invited to that party. You're not going to be invited to try out this new project. You're not going to work.
Can you blame me for being a conspiracy theorist at this point? I mean, they've been proven right a few times.
We always say now that the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth is about 6 months.
You did used to live in Hollywood. Did you ever get invited to a Diddy party? So Michael Knowles, I actually did want to ask you about the Diddy parties. But before we talk about that, I think it's important every time that we see all of the media pointing in one direction, we have to wonder what is it that they're trying to cover up or hide from us. Have you heard about everything going on with 23andMe?
Vaguely. I heard that there was some issue, there was some headline about it, and I read, my head's in the news for much of the day. I still don't even really know what the story is.
So I've been doing a deep dive on it, and essentially every single board member over at 23andMe, which we know has millions of people's data from sending in their DNA samples, unfortunately mine included, and now the reason that they're resigning is because the company is progressing towards going private. Now, by going private with all of this DNA data that they have, that means that even though they say they're not going to, but we know how that works, they could sell our DNA to advertisers who then target us with ads based on our genetic makeup. They also could potentially give it to insurance companies who might deny you coverage based on your DNA. And, a lot more darker conspiracies there. And I want to know, just from your perspective, do you think that this is something dangerous and that we should be paying more attention to?
Well, my first take whenever I hear a company is going, I actually didn't even know 23andMe was public, but if I hear a company going from public to private, my first thought, before we get to all the crazy conspiracies, because they do have a lot of power, they have a lot of data about us, is just, I guess this company's going bankrupt otherwise. I guess this company's doing very poorly and they need to take it private in order to save the company, which then makes me think, okay, maybe people aren't interested in this product anymore. They're not interested in history. They're not interested in the real aspects of their own identity, all of which we know to be the case because people adopt all sorts of fantastical identities and we spit on history and we topple statues of our forebears. So that to me seems more like a sign of the times. Now, as for what these guys can do, yeah, it's rather scary that we have given our genetic data to anyone, a public company, a private company, to the government, and now they can do with it as they please. In terms of targeting advertising, they're already basically in our minds and know what we're thinking before we think it half the time. So yeah, so that I'm not too worried about that, but I suppose some people will hear this information and they'll be really terrified because they're surprised that the future could look so dark. But I'm a conservative. I know the future's getting that dark. In fact, I am what they call a conservative optimist. The conservative pessimist says things can't get any worse than this. But we say, oh yes, they can, and they certainly will. That basically at the end of history, there will be a happy ending, but it's going to get real weird and real dark and real painful, and there are probably going to be like you clones, going around everywhere selling you cheap crap made in China and going to Diddy freak-off parties before the day is through.
I mean, that's fair, and you are right. They are going broke. But what alarmed me with so many of the board members dropping out of the company so abruptly and not wanting to say anything about it, and I started looking more at their history and things that have happened recently, is they've been having these huge data breaches as well. Like right after October 7th, they had this huge data breach where these hackers specifically went and found Ashkenazi Jewish descent, or all the people with Ashkenazi Jewish descent, they stole their data. And then there was another demographic that they specifically targeted. So I just get a little paranoid. Can you blame me for being a conspiracy theorist at this point? I mean, they've been proven right a few times.
We always say now that a difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth is about 6 months. It'd be kind of funny, though, if the people who hate the Jews decide what they're going to do is steal all this Jewish DNA, and then I don't know, what are they going to do? They're going to clone the Jews or something, and then that seems like the worst kind of anti-Semite you ever heard in the world. They're just going to make more Jews. I don't know, right. Joke's on them, I guess.
I keep saying that too. The one thing I'm not afraid of is them making a clone of me. If they try to make a clone of me, just know you have double the trouble, because then we're about to start flipping things over. And if the clone of me knows that they're a clone, they're going to be that much pettier. They're gonna know they have nothing to lose.
They got nothing, man.
Right.
Let's go.
So you did used to live in Hollywood. Did you ever get invited to a Diddy party?
I was not invited to a Diddy party. Hearing all these stories, I'm really somewhat offended because I was in plays and TV shows and movies, but they were relatively low budget. I wasn't ever in a Marvel movie or something. So maybe I just didn't hack it high enough up the totem pole to get invited to the weird freak-off drug-fueled orgies with the IVs. However, there was one time I was invited to a sex party. And I was a very nice guy, a friend of mine in LA. I'd worked with him a little bit in show business. And he said, "Oh, we should get a drink, after work or whatever." I said, "Oh yeah, sure, man, we'll get a drink." It's like, yeah. And at some point, you should come to a sex party. I was like, "What now? Come again?" He was like, "Yeah, there's." I said, "What do you mean a sex party?" He goes, "Yeah, there's sex parties." I said, "Where?" He goes, "Oh, they're all over the place. There's sex parties all over this town." I was like, "Huh. Well, I'm good. Like, I think if I can avoid going to sex parties for the rest of my life, that's probably a good thing for my physical health, for my spiritual health. That's good." But I guess that then colors my view of the Diddy freak-off parties, which is, you hear a story like this, or previously you heard a story like Jeffrey Epstein having this weird sex island, and you think, wow, that's crazy that place exists. But that's not the crazy part. Mm-hmm. The crazy part is, this stuff is actually pretty common.
Yeah.
It's much more common than I think many people would like to admit.
Do you think it's realistic for there to be so many people, so many Jeffrey Epstein, so many Harvey Weinsteins and P. Diddy's exposed? Do you think eventually it's going to get to where it stops? Or do you think that that's one of those things that's just so far gone? Particularly the corruption in Hollywood, the sexual exploitation in Hollywood. Do you think that that's ever going to make a turn in culture?
No, that's built in. Because in show business, the people are commodities. So the agents they're not trading cattle, they're trading you. You're the cattle in show business. So when people go in and they audition, they're selling themselves. It's there's something to the craft of acting which can be artistic and beautiful, but there is a reason actors have been lumped in with prostitutes for most of human history. It's a similar approach to business. So wherever that exists, there's going to be the casting couch. Now, certain legal decisions and policies have made this worse. So when the Supreme Court broke up the studio system, it made things worse because everyone became a freelancer. Everyone was more economically vulnerable, and they were more open to predation by the Harvey Weinstein-like characters. But the casting couch goes back all the way through the studio system. It goes back to the earliest days of Hollywood. So that's going to stick around, and it's going to be especially pronounced in show business. However, you can go back even further. Go back to, say, the Israelites wandering around the desert. And we recall that Moses decided to go up the mountain and talk to God and receive the Ten Commandments. And Moses had been gone for about 5 seconds, and they all start worshiping a golden calf. And I think when you're a kid, you hear this story and you picture a bunch of very orderly Israelites just kind of kneeling down before a golden calf. That's not what was going on. They were doing Diddy freak-off stuff. That's what actual pagan, bacchanal, idol worshiping festivals involved, a ton of freaky, weird sex stuff. And so that's what they were doing. This is a persistent aspect of human nature, certainly of pagan societies. And in certain places, it's going to be more pronounced than others. And Los Angeles is sometimes known as Gomorrah by the Sea. That's how my friend Jeremy Boring refers to it. So it ain't changing anytime soon, would be my guess.
Well, with all the chaos that we have in Hollywood, do you think that celebrities should be putting their political opinions out there?
They shouldn't, because it is humiliating for them to reveal their ignorance on the public stage. But they're public figures, and so they're probably going to do that. It used to be that there was an incentive not to share their political views because, as Michael Jordan said, Republicans buy sneakers too, because everyone in America watched Johnny Carson. So Johnny Carson was a big lib, but he kept his political views mostly to himself because a ton of Republicans watched him and middle America watched him, and he just saw no reason to shrink his audience. That cultural consensus is gone. People don't really watch the networks anymore. They don't go see the same movies anymore. The media landscape has frayed. So people are already dividing themselves up into different audience groups based on ever more niche affinities. Mm-hmm. So there is conservative entertainment. The Daily Wire is producing conservative movies. There are other places that are doing that. PragerU obviously is producing a lot of conservative content. And so, people feel a little more comfortable speaking about politics because the audiences are already so divided. Actors are public figures. There's no reason to believe that they have a more sophisticated view of politics than Joe Blow down the street, and there's a lot of reason to believe they have a less sophisticated view of politics, but they're public figures, and so we're, I think, denying that reality when we try to pretend that artists won't hold political sway. They will. The liberal establishment knows that. That's why they support these figures. That's why they've invested so heavily in entertainment.
Do you think it's that the celebrities are more comfortable now saying their political opinions, or is it that they're being forced to by their publicist?
Well, they're being forced not to support the other side. That's for sure. They will be punished. You could have a whole episode talking about the actors who've been canceled by places like CAA or William Morris Endeavor, or being kicked out of work, movie franchises, TV shows for being conservative. And so the consequence of that is there is a pressure, sometimes subtle, sometimes pronounced, to support liberal candidates. It also is a reminder, though, that while there is a blacklist in Hollywood, and we could name the actors who are on it, the problem is less about the blacklist than about the whitelist. It's kind of like any business. Business is not just about having a resume and filling out a form on a computer and being selected by some faceless bureaucrat. Business is about people. We're the political animals. So you want to do business with people you know and you like, or the people that are friends of friends or associates of associates, or you're familiar with an institution that they previously worked with, or they're a graduate of a university that maybe is your university or one you like. It's a people and a relational business. So if you go into the Kamala Harris fundraiser that's being hosted by George Clooney, and then you're going to the party afterward, maybe it's the freak-off party, maybe it's a more wholesome party, and if you're palling around with these people, they're more likely to work with you. And if you contradict their most deeply held beliefs, used to be that religion was your most deeply held belief. Today, because people are broadly secular and practically atheist, politics has become the more deeply held belief. Well, if you don't agree with their most deeply held beliefs, you're not going to be invited to that party. You're not going to be invited to try out this new project. You're just not going to work.
One of the things I'm always asking myself is who benefits the most from the division or the chaos that's being caused? Like, do you think that there's someone or an entity or any type of political group that is benefiting from creating such a huge divide in the American society?
Well, our enemies benefit, certainly, the enemies of America, which is why they sometimes try to sow discord, even though they don't exactly have a horse in the race. But then also the winning side benefits. So we don't need to be totally conspiratorial about it. Republicans will benefit from division if division creates clear distinctions between the two parties, and those clear distinctions persuade more people to vote for Republicans. Or vice versa. More often, I think it's probably Democrats who benefit from that. But clarity is charity, as a friend of mine points out. So you want there to be some divisions, because otherwise you wouldn't know who to vote for. You wouldn't know who to support. You wouldn't have a clear vision for the country. Division is not necessarily a bad thing instrumentally. You want there to be unity ultimately. But you think about the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution, who seemed to deplore factionalism and warn against it. But there was immediately factionalism, or at the very least there were political parties which often redounded to factionalism. Though there were not to be formal political parties in America, there were the Federalists, there were anti-federalists, there were Jeffersonian Republicans, and by the election of 1800, so George Washington's just leaving, you already had two rather distinct political parties fighting over who was going to win. So the division is just natural. I don't think we should try to deny it or even stamp it out. We should clarify divisions within civil society, and then when we win, we should try to bring people and persuade them, bring them over to our view, so we have a unified country.
I feel like we don't have a civil society anymore.
Yeah, we have an uncivil society.
I'm actually working on a mini doc that's coming out this October called Their Lives Mattered, where we're talking about the innocent victims of crime, which is often children who are just playing or getting their hair cut, and they end up being shot and killed by a drive-by from gang members. And it makes you just sit there and you think, why are there so many soft on crime policies? Why are there so many DAs who seem like they love nothing more than putting more criminals on the street? So I just wanted a general perspective from you. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that it has become almost a goal for crime to be so out of control, because it seems like this can't be something that just organically happens. To me, it almost looks like there's an effort put into it, but maybe
Sure.
I'm exaggerating.
Tactically, chaos can breed opportunity for political operators. So you sometimes hear the phrase anarcho-tyranny, that as society breaks down, it allows the would-be tyrants to grab a little bit more power because people are vulnerable. You sometimes hear the phrase, the Latin phrase, solve et coagula. First we break down, then you bring it all back together and you reassemble it as you like. I mean, this is actually the theory of training for the U.S. Marines. You got to break people down and then build them up in the way that you want them to be. So there can be good uses of that through education, but there can be really dark uses of that as well. But I think there's just something deeper about the left-wing ideology that leads to this, which is it's an acidic ideology, liberalism. It just breaks things down. It breaks down even natural institutions, most notably the family. But it breaks down the nation, it breaks down civic associations, because it views mankind as fundamentally an individual. And it views man not as an individual with obligations to his family from whom he comes and to his community and to his country, but rather as an individual primarily endowed with rights and entitlement and maximal autonomy. Not someone who owes his life to God, but someone who can do whatever the hell he pleases. It's the liberal view of liberty, which is the ability to do whatever you want, rather than the conservative view of liberty, which is the right to do what you ought to do. So if the liberal view of liberty is to predominate, and we're just supposed to be creatures with maximal individual autonomy, then that means you're going to stop clamping down on drugs. Well, if you stop clamping down on drugs, you're going to get druggies all over your streets, and you're going to get homeless people, and homeless people are going to attack you sometimes.
And they do.
And they do, especially in Los Angeles, and New York, and Chicago, and D.C., and all over the place. If you believe in maximal individual autonomy, you're going to let people squat in private homes. You're not going to really clamp down on that. You're going to let people be vagrants. You're going to let people walk around with mental illness. You're going to shut down the insane asylums that were actually good for the patients, and now you're going to force them to live on the street and potentially die of exposure. You're going to, as a consequence of that, you're going to see people committing crimes, and paradoxically, you're going to deny their individual agency, because you're going to say, these poor people are just the products of a system. They grew up in the ghetto. They never had the support. The country is structurally opposed to them. And so we got to go soft on the criminals. You've got to constantly be taking the perspective that is contrary to the traditional view. And so that means ultimately that you're going to sympathize with the criminals and you're going to neglect the victims. And I think this is just kind of built in to the liberal ideology. There are some nasty people exploiting this cynically, but I think they also just have a false view of human nature and politics, and it leads to chaos.